If your deaf friends come over, they stay forever. It doesn't matter if it's midnight. We try to go closer and closer to the door. If you're in a restaurant, we'll be chatting. And the waiters will come up and say, oh, we're about to close in 5 minutes. And we'll be like, okay. But we will continue to talk for 10, 15 minutes. And then we'll get up and move and outside and then chat and chat and chat. And then we get a little closer to the door. And then we'll keep chatting. And then they'll finally shut off the lights to get us out. And then when we're out in the parking lot, we still have our goodbye things, and we'll be still chatting. And even in the cars, we'll be chatting until finally we leave. Realize that we rely on information sharing and hearing people because they could hear the passerbyers of everyday traffic. They get that information through that, but the rest deaf people, we get it through our communication with others. And it's the most important part of our culture. So when I talk about signing and sign language isn't new. It's been around for thousands of years. But we have to fight every day to preserve our sign language. And we have experienced a lot of oppression and discrimination from other groups as well. Just like other groups, how they've experienced discrimination and oppression in their cultures and language, so we have too. If we look back on our history, in 470 BC, in the Greeks, there was a character written. Suppose you have someone who can't use their voice but wants to express something, their feelings, their opinions, but they can't with their voice. They realized that they could use gestures and facial expressions to express their needs and to communicate. That is the earliest record of using sign language thousands of years ago. Now, here in America, if you go back to the 1700s, in Martha's Vineyard Island, over on the East Coast, it was the largest community of deaf people there. It's generational, so about 1 in 25 deaf people were born. Just on that island, everyone signed, and even those who were hearing. Even the hearing people signed, spoke. It was just that world there on that island. Everyone had that community of being able to interact. There were no barriers. Deaf people were accepted and business went on as usual. But later on in the 80s and 70s, sign language was set up as the first formal language for deaf people. That was our history. Oh, interpreter correction. The first deaf school was set up, and people from Martha's Vineyards went in, and sign language was established. ASL was more established, and it began to spread as schools were spreading and setting up. So Gallaudet University over in Washington, D.C. was set up in 1864, and it provided college degrees for deaf people, and it's the only university for deaf people. And deaf people would gather there and go there to get their degrees and education, and because they were accepted as normal people. And hearing people could even interact with them, and that is a great world to have. About 66 years later, though, in 1908, interpreter, we need to clarify, there was a very big impact in our deaf community. In 1880, the Milan Conference happened. Teachers from around the world gathered to discuss deaf education. And what was decided and voted is that sign language should be banned in teaching deaf children, and that oralism, teaching children to speak, should be the norm. It changed the deaf world. And it even impacted America. Many deaf teachers were fired. They replaced them all with hearing teachers to teach deaf children how to speak. Oralism. That really impacted the deaf world. It was dark times. It was a lot of oppression. It was a small world for deaf people, and they were brought down and separated from the hearing world. It was dark times, and we had to suffer through that for many years. And finally, in the 1960s, over at Gallaudet University, there was an English professor. And he noticed that sign language was fluid, as he would see it through other students and deaf people there. And so he researched it. And finally, he was able to prove that ASL was a real language with grammar and rules and syntax. It had mouth morphemes. We have 5 parameters. Our hand shapes, palm orientation, space use and movement, our non-manuals. Sign language is not based off of English structure. They are totally separate. And people assumed that sign language was based off of English, but it wasn't. So that idea was finally out and was able to bring us back. And it pushed us to recognize ASL as an actual true language. So around that time, many hearing children of deaf adults, we call them CODAs, C-O-D-A, they were born into the deaf world, so their first language was sign language, and they grew up with their deaf parents in that world. And they had a responsibility to become interpreters, because they would interpret for their parents to keep the communication between the hearing world and deaf world. We don't have enough CODAs. I wish we had more babies born at that time to keep up with the requirements and needs. Finally, in the 1980s, it was when more colleges were setting up interpreting training programs around the U.S. It skyrocketed. Many hearing students were clueless about sign language, but they would enter in the interpreting program and learn. And they realized that it takes more than 2 to 4 years to learn the language, especially in depth, and to learn about the culture too, not just the language.